Okay, we're at 1 minute past now, so we'll get proceeding started. First of all, on behalf of the Passive House Association of Ireland and the Passive House Trust, we welcome you all today to our webinar with Gwilym still, where we're talking about the Spencer Library in Oxford. I just introduce you to our other panelists here today. We've Dr. Barry McCarran. Dr. Barry McCarran is representing the Ministerial Advisory Group, who have been really important in getting this series of webinars for the public service in Northern Ireland. So we're delighted to have you here with us here today, Barry. Barry sits on the committee which over the Department of Communities, and this works across all of the departments in Northern Ireland. So great to have you here. You'll also see calling herself marketing, but this I'll introduce Fiona Flax. Fiona is working at all the things in the background of the Passive House Association and making sure that our members and we're getting our messaging out and so forth. And then I would like to introduce you to Gwilym Still, who will be doing most of the conversation with us here today. So Gwilym is going to present. Gwilym was the Passive House designer on the Spencer Library. I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to have a look at this building before you came online. I'm sure Gwilym has loads of stuff to tell us about it. It's a fascinating story, a beautiful building. And the fact that it houses all those precious manuscripts is just even makes this building even more special when it's linked so much to history. So Max Fordham, as a business, we're responsible for the passive house design, the MEP, and the acoustics on this building. So, and I'm led to believe, Gwilym, that you love the science of passive. So we're really excited to hear all your learnings and your insights from this particular case study. I would ask that as we go through, if you have any questions to ask at all, you can enter those in the Q&A box. We'll go through those at the end, and feel free to, as you're going, and then Gwilym will answer any questions. Gwilym tells us that his presentation will take about 30 minutes, so that will leave us with lots of time for questions and answers, which I'm sure everybody will have. I just see as well, Anne-Marie Fallon has just joined us online as well. So Anne-Marie is representing the Passive House Trust in the UK and is one of the directors there. So I'm sure she will introduce herself in due course. Gwilym, I think without further ado, we'll hand over to you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Caroline. Hi, everybody. Lovely to be here today. Let's get the slides up. Okay. Hopefully that's coming through okay. So I'm going to chat about the Spencer building in Oxford, going through both the passive house design side of it and some bits from delivery as well, and then some reflections and lessons learned that we've taken from the project. So as a running order, talking briefly about the location, motivation side of it, some of the constraints that came with the site and the project and the team who worked on it, then the overall passive house strategy, and then talking about a few different individual details, picking up on the common features of a passive house project, and then a bit on the outcomes and the lessons learned from it, and just framing it a bit more widely in other projects as well. So the brief for the project then really came from Corpus as a very long-standing college in Oxford. They wanted to increase their study space they had available for their students in particular. They wanted to improve accessibility. They wanted to provide archive storage. They've got lots of precious manuscripts and things they need to preserve. And as with lots of institutions, they're keenly aware of their environmental responsibility as well. So they wanted to do something that was really sustainable. And as part of that wider context, they're a long-standing Oxford college, so this is the first time basically that they changed their library in more than half a century. So it's quite a big deal for them and for everybody else who got to participate in it. What we think has been delivered at the end of the project then is an increase in that study space. They've got 55 new reader spaces and 6 dedicated research desks. Accessibility has been improved, not just within the new library building itself, although that is fully accessible, but also the the old library, which we've got a photo of in the centre at the bottom here, has been set up. So now it's got step-free access to that space from within the college grounds, which wasn't the case beforehand. So it's been really nice to see the kind of benefits ripple out through the wider college estates. They've got the new archive storage space, which has been created, and they've achieved Passive House certification and done it with this stunning building as well. So very briefly, the architects are Right and Right. This is their first Passive House project. Project managers Synergy, Alan Baxter's on structures, Ridge as the QS, Kingerlee, who do quite a bit of work in Oxford as the main contractor. We did several disciplines, and then Warm were our Passive House certifiers. Very quickly, we do a range of different bits and pieces on projects, and on this one we picked up there, so MEP, Passive House acoustics, and some other bits of the building physics that go with it. For those of you who kick around the Passive House side of things, you often come across Nick Grant, and Nick Grant's introduced me to quite a lot of Eames quotes, and this is one of them. One of the few effective keys to the design problem is the ability to recognize as many constraints as possible, and then enthusiasm for working within those constraints. So if you set the slightly gendered language aside, I think that's a really good approach, and I think that really applied to this scheme. So if we take here, this is an aerial view of Google Maps. Inside the pink box is the site that we're working with. So on the west-hand side, there's Christchurch with their picture gallery, and actually, if I get a pointer here, so behind this wall that's basically adjacent to our site, they keep some of their Da Vinci artworks. You can see at the north of the site, we're connecting onto the existing college building, the quads. At the south, we're also connecting onto an existing building. The height of the building is constrained by the local context and the height of the other college buildings. We've got beneath the ground some fairly sensitive ground conditions and archaeology we couldn't disturb and bits like that. And you can see heading off towards the north, so north is up the page. It's a fairly cozy site entrance as well. So all in all, I'll date myself a bit, but it reminded me of that that record Stuck in the Middle with You. So that was at least some of the constraints that we're looking at on the scheme. The overall Passive House strategy then, so you want the massing of the building to be efficient, so that as much as possible the fabric and the form of the building are doing the hard work before we get into any active systems. For people who have come across this diagram before, there's this idea of the form factor of the building, so the total heat loss area divided by the internal floor area. The massing of the building had a form factor in the kind of low 2-ish or so, which is pretty reasonable. This diagram normally gets used for a single usage type that's being applied throughout the whole building. So whether that's offices or multi-residential or something else. What we've actually got here is a combination of a couple of different things. We've got the space we want the students and staff and so on to be able to study and research in. We've got the archive space, and then we've got some other ancillary spaces as well. So the idealized archive setup, I think, in terms of thermal zoning, would look something nice and simple and a bit like this. So archive off to one space where you're quite happy to let that go a bit cooler in the winter time when you don't want it to get too warm in summer, and it's a kind of fairly free running space if you've made it really well thermally insulated from outside. Then some kind of buffer space in between the two, and then an office space or other study space that's going to have people in for the majority of the time. So that's the kind of platonic ideal, I think, and there's some really nice built examples of that, including the Hereford Archive and Record Centre that Archetype works on and other schemes like that. Unfortunately, that wasn't quite available to us in this scheme because of those, the constraints of which sides we could go to. So this is the section through the building just to show that principal thermal zoning. So we've got the archive space, which has been deliberately set up so the two spaces stack. if you were looking in the other section, the long section through the building, it's been neatened up there as well, so it's as close to a cuboid as we can get it, and is fairly fairly compact. We've got plant space down in the basement, partly because we need somewhere to put it. We're also housing some of the legacy kit that's serving the adjacent buildings, and also the roof line is pretty well defined and tightened up. You can just about see the outline of the adjacent buildings behind. And then we've got the main occupied spaces. You can see in here there's first, second and third floor study spaces with views to outside, and some more internalised spaces, and then open racking as well on the second floor here. So I won't try to expect you to read the plans in lots of detail, but just to know really that there's, okay, if I use the pointer, so this is the kind of the outline of our new building. This is actually some of the adjacent building you can see we're abutting onto and connecting onto. Same at the south. This zone here has got the archives in it, and again you can see that at the first floor above. And then the stairs come through and let all the students and others onto these study spaces. And on the east elevation here, you can see we had some facade retention as well. So it's very much kind of kept cozy on all sides, really, by what's around it. Okay. One of the bits that was quite interesting for us for this particular kind of library and study space, distinct from a more conventional municipal library, I guess, is that when we talked with the college about it, they keep this space open 24/7 for not quite 365 days a year, but very close to that. And so that gives some interesting differences. It means that the ventilation systems are going to be running all the time and giving fresh air to people who need it in the buildings all the time. We talked through with the college to understand what they thought those occupancy profiles actually did look like, including exam times, slow times over holidays, etc. And we set up the energy modelling in the Passive House planning package, the Passive House energy tool, to reflect those. So we wanted to do that. So we want to encourage good decisions and to best reflect the building as we can in the modelling. With those relatively high levels of ventilation, you pay for that a bit in terms of the fan energy use, and you pay for it in terms of the heat loss from the building that ventilation brings with it. And we didn't want to be kind of artificially penalised for either of those. We just wanted to line the two bits up. And given that whenever there are people inside the building, the people are emitting heat, and all of their active equipment is emitting heat. I know we've got a photo here of two people studiously holding paper, but there'll be other people with laptops, there's the lighting, etc. So we did our own internal heat gain calculations for this as a slightly specialist case compared to the default values for offices, etc. And went through that with Warm as the certifier to agree that as an approach we could use, so that we're best aligning the design with what's going to happen in reality, and reflecting that expected occupancy. We knew we wanted the scheme to be all electric in terms of space heating as well, and that we wanted to have capacity to do a little bit of cooling for the archive space as well for the current conditions, and to be future-proofed for some active cooling as the climate continues to heat up for the rest of the building. So the approach for this scheme is that it's heated by a ground source heat pump. This view on the right here, okay, if I get the pointer, so this is from the north elevation of the new build, and is looking up through that kind of landscaped area coming just to the north boundary of the site. So we've got a fairly low capacity ground source heat pump. So the passive house approach is really good for minimizing that heating demand. The PHPP was also useful because it gives you a heating demand profile over the whole year, and so we were able to use that to help inform the design of the borehole system, so we could give that to the ground source subcontractor and say, this is what we need out of the ground each month, and this is what we want you to size the system to be able to deliver. And we're then delivering that heat into the building through underfloor heating everywhere. So that's not mandatory for a passive house scheme by any means. It does mean we can deliver the heat really efficiently. It means we haven't grabbed any of the fairly at a premium floor space within the building, and we have then got the option to in the future run that in reverse and give a little bit of background cooling through the building as well, which is quite nice. The cooling for the archive is basically delivered by taking the groundwater from the boreholes and putting it through a heat exchanger to cool the supply or recirculated air into the archives down a bit. So it's a fairly low energy way of taking a bit of heat out of those spaces. We'll talk about ventilation in a bit more detail later, but just principally to note, we've followed the same sort of cascade ventilation approach that you'd use for a passive house, but beefed it up a bit for a larger building. So supplying air into fresh air rooms, like the occupied spaces, transferring through intermediate zones, and then extracting from spaces with particular pollutants in, like toilets, storerooms, etc. On the domestic hot water side of things, there's not a huge amount of domestic hot water demand in the building. You know, it's quite distinct from a hotel or student accommodation or something like that. So we tried to just keep things really simple. Rather than putting in a hot water heat pump and then a big circulation pipework loop, we've taken the approach that's been used on lots of other passive house schemes of just going for nice, simple point of use water heaters with minimal to no storage loss and putting them very close to the outlets. There's very little distribution loss as well. So bits like the cleaners cupboards and the toilets and a few other wash hand basins are just fed from these little electric point of use water heaters. So that's the general approach for the project, and then we'll go through a couple of example details for some different aspects of the passive house side of things. So this is the common diagram of the five principles when people talk about doing passive house principles. A term I'm a bit allergic to, but we could have that as a separate discussion. So we're going to work through those in turn and just look at one or two examples of how it's been applied on the project. So starting off with the ventilation and the mech vents with heat recovery that we've got. So like I said, this is the kind of the high level concept really. We don't want to move too much air around the building. We don't want to have more ductwork than we need, more plants than we need, and more energy use than we can get away with, but we still want good levels of air quality through the whole building. So the cascade approach with supplying fresh air into the occupied spaces, transfer through intermediate zones, extract from rooms with lots of pollutants in. The actual approach we've taken here is, this is a basement plant room you can see on the right hand side. So that's where the ventilation unit that's serving all of the study spaces lives, and the vent unit for the archive as well. It's terminated to outside, so we get the pointer again. On the right hand side here, these are kind of two little light well details where we're running some ductwork through the wall to get to outside. You could see from the section there's not really space up on the roof to put the unit in a slightly more simple arrangement. So we're tucked down in the basement, we're completely out of way, and we're actually outside the thermal line of the building. So the supply and extract ductwork, which is what's shown in the blue and the pink here, basically runs at high level through this basement space and then goes up through the floor insulation, and at that point it enters the thermal line of the building. And if we look at that on an example section for the ground floor, I've just color coded some different spaces so you can see greener spaces that we're supplying fresh air into. So here's a kind of office and reception space on the ground floor, a meeting room and a small office as well here. Yellow are transitional spaces that we're transferring air through. So the air that's put into this space, for example, transfers through this little waiting room and then gets pulled out of the other adjacent spaces. And similarly, where we're supplying fresh air into the lobby here, it comes through into this circulation space in the stairwell, and then is extracted from the toilets and so on. The archive in the blue here is treated by a completely separate system because we're using very, very low ventilation rates for that, and we want to remove a little bit of heat from there at times of year when we don't want to from the rest of the building as well. So moving on from ventilation then onto air tightness, we've got actually for the building 2 different primary structure arrangements. So the archive is basically a concrete box and is made to be as close to bomb-proof as you can, because you want the material in there to be safe and protected even if something horrific happens like the building going on fire. The rest of the building, for a range of reasons, is a steel frame setup, and for most of that we've then picked an air tightness strategy for each of those that suited the particular structure and the build-ups that went with them. So on the left-hand side, you can see what was used as the general air tightness approach for the building, and this is similar to a lot of what you see from, say, a timber frame passive house individual house through to a school, and some of the other interesting timber framed and similar buildings around the place. So we've got an OSB board with a proprietary kind of applied air and vapor control line on it. That's the green layer you can see here. You can see the odd little dabs of blue where people have done any touch-ups for bits where they think they've damaged it. And you can see the blue taping at the joints between the different sheets as well to keep that completely airtight. And then on the right-hand side, around the archive zone here, obviously it's not really sensible to try to use the OSB in that instance because we need a really well fire-rated archive space overall. And also, as the bulk of it is a kind of cast in situ concrete approach, that's been used with relying on the concrete and then using a liquid applied membrane over that to try and make it or to ensure it's really, really airtight as well. So 2 different approaches. Both have worked quite well. We had a few interesting bits as well around the testing of these, I think, because you can see from the kind of the dashed yellow lines on here, we want the two airtight lines to be airtight and independent of each other. We don't want really warm air from the occupied spaces in the summertime leaking through into the archive. And so when we did the airtight testing of the building, we've had it tested as 2 separate zones, and did a little bit of work to be able to deliberately test the doors to the archive separately as well. So normally if you do an airtightness test, you put a fan in a blower door arrangement, but if you do that into the archive here, then you're kind of occupying the door that's probably the weakest part of the airtight envelope. So there was a little bit of work just to figure out a way of being able to do that pressurization and test the install quality of the door as well. That was quite useful for us because it basically flushed out that some of the ancillaries to do the access control on the doors were leaking a bit of air through, which we didn't want, and so there was some remedial works done on site between the second and the third of the airtightness test to make sure that that was all really well sealed and performed well. Then, sorry, we go on to the thermal bridging side of things. So it's not strictly true what the diagram says here. You don't have to have completely thermal bridge free design. You do need to understand where thermal bridges exist within your design. So where you've got conductive things cutting through the insulation line, and you need to have that built into a whole building energy model and understanding of where heat's flowing through the building. We haven't tried to eliminate all of the thermal bridges from the design, and in fact, given some of the constraints of the building, we've probably got slightly more than you would expect to have on, say, a new build multi-residential block or something like that. So there's just a couple of examples here. The one in the top left is from the shallow parapets we've got, where we've used, you can see in this photo, the kind of proprietary cast-in thermal break products that let us keep the pointer again, keep the insulation line pretty much continuous going through these products here, but still provide the support and restraint for the parapet above. And then this detail bottom left is the example of where we've got this retained facade elevation. We want to be able to give some restraint to that. So we're not trying to hold it up, but we're trying to give it some lateral restraints. So going kind of in and out of the page. And that was done with a relatively few localized steel fixings with then some a thermal break to separate that from the primary structure steel, and then kind of careful infilling of the insulation around it afterwards. So the diagram on the right hand side shows the this is one of the energy balance tools you get from PHPP. So you can see the different heat gains on the right hand side. So solar gains, internal heat gains, and active heating system. And then on the left hand side, you can see the different heat losses from the building. And you can see from this, again in the pink box, the thermal bridges at about 6 and a bit kilowatt hours a square metre a year. So that's quite interesting to see, and just see in the context of, compared to say all of the external walls, it's about 60% of the heat loss through the walls coming from the varied thermal bridges around the scheme. Then for the general insulation approach, we've mostly used mineral wool based products, both to help with low combustibility, to help with longevity, and to help with ease of installing them and keeping them fixed and without gaps or things which will compromise their performance. And so just a couple of photos. This is on the west elevation of the building. So we've got a stone cladding system that's going over this, and you can see, to give Kingerlee their dues, the install quality is really high. We've got these fairly limited steel fixings going back through the insulation line, and what was quite nice in a way with this setup, I think, was it meant that the insulation can go in, the fixings go in, and then the stone laying afterwards can be done with the sliding clips being able to move up and down. So there's a slight decoupling of the stonework going in with the insulation going in. And then if we move slightly round the section, this is just an example from the insulation going in up on the roof. So again, you can see the quality control here is really good. Everything's tightly fitted up between the insulation and the timbers. You can see the first layer that's been installed here onto the roof surface. These are the timbers that are going to support the lead roofing that's across the whole thing, which is picked up for durability. And then you can just see the start of some insulation going in between the timbers. So there's a second layer of insulation that goes on top of that to have a bit less thermal bridging as well. Both of those photos are taken from the site QA, which Kingerlee did, and then submitted through as their evidence. I think they did a really nice job of integrating that into their own in-house QA system. So it was a thing that ran as part of an integrated process rather than a separate standalone kind of overhead thing to have. And then finally, out of the 5, the Windows side of it. So I won't talk about all of them, but I think one of the most interesting ones really was this retained facade approach we've got, where there's historic windows here, single glazed, thermally terrible, air tightness terrible, but for historic reasons we want to keep them. And then you can see on the left hand side where the thermal line of our building is, where the airtight line of our building is, etc. And so we made the decision really to keep the existing windows, but to use them as pretty much like a sacrificial thermal line, and to not rely on them for any kind of energy saving performance. So the right hand side is what's actually being installed. You can see we've kept the existing windows are basically propped open, and allow air to come through and ventilate whenever the internal windows are open. The internal windows are set up so they can operate in tilt mode, like you can see in the left-hand one, and crack open to let a little bit of air through, just if you want a bit of mild cooling in the summertime, and then can open wide if people want to do purge ventilation or remove heat more quickly in the summertime. Here's the kind of view on. So again, generally the windows are set up so the outer ones allow quite a lot of opening area. The inner one is the one that the people within the building are going to interact with on a day-to-day basis. And from the outside, it looks a bit like this. So fairly sensitive in terms of external appearance. And we did the modelling work to pick up the reduction in solar gain from the glass and the framing, and to factor that into both the daylighting modelling and the solar heat gain modelling that happens within PHPP. So in terms of outcomes, we've got formal Passivhaus certification, which is great. The overall air tightness is about a permeability of 0.6 cubic meters per meter squared per hour. So that was a result we were happy with, particularly given the kind of complexity and how involved the project was. And the in-use energy figures, this is definitely an upper bound because we didn't actually have the meter reading when the building was initially occupied, but it does meet the UK net zero carbon building standard target for kind of higher education buildings, which is good. These are a few of the views from both inside and outside the building. So this is looking from the north elevation of the building out across. This is a study space on one of the upper floors, and this is up on the third floor. In the front left-hand side, you can just see one of the height adjustable desks that have been provided as well, so that people using wheelchairs find it a bit easier to study as well. And this is on the ground floor. And then again, one of the upper floors, you can see the roof lights opening for natural ventilation. And I think it sits quite nicely in the pointer again. You know, this is the building, and you can see in that kind of general Oxford's architectural context, I think it sits quite nicely. So very quickly for lessons learned and reflections, on the air tightness side of things, I think the basic strategies we had worked well, but we found it quite difficult to do some of the kind of temporary sealing to test just our building distinct from the two adjacent buildings, the north and the south. So if I was doing the project again, I'd probably try to make more of a sort of a sacrificial airtight line, or one which got built in just to help with the testing rather than because it was needed in the long term. We did quite a lot of benchmarking with Kingerlee, and they engaged with that really well. And I think that was really valuable because it helped us go from, you know, initial details like the bits you can see on the left, which is a mock-up built as, you know, it's off the critical path of the building and was generally pretty good, but had a couple of niggles and bits that needed addressed, to getting this, you know, really high quality install on the right hand side, and that being able to flow through the general construction process. We've really liked having access to and being part of that wider Passivhaus community. So both Passivhaus Trust and the AECB for some of the case studies that we looked at, as to help kind of inform the design for us. And I think one of the good bits of these projects as well is just to try and, you know, execute the basics really well. So I quite like this game of Go, and there's this quote from a guy who's a professional player saying, you know, you can kind of consider yourself an expert if you just keep on making ordinary, sensible moves. You don't have to do anything that's very flashy or brilliant or exceptional. Just you know, keep making sensible decisions and follow them all the way through. And then just to set it in a slightly broader context, you know, the project worked really well. It's not in isolation. So this is a Passivhaus student resi project we did where the peak heating load's less than 10 watts a square meter from the metering. This is the Intopia project we worked on with Archetype, where the energy use intensity is about 52 kilowatt hours a square meter a year. So that meets the UK net zero carbon building standard for 2050. And this is a Passivhaus monastery project, Buddhist monastery project we worked on, which was interesting. just as one of those examples of it's not certified, but it has followed the passive house approach generally. It's got an air source heat pump, so it's all electric. It's got a heat pump delivering a space heating and the domestic hot water. This is the heat pump unit on the right-hand side. The scale's a bit wrong, so I've had a go at correcting it. So this is the little 12 kilowatt heat pump that's kind of tucked just around the corner that's doing this 1,200 square meter building. And very quickly, just to say, we've also seen it be useful to use some of the passive house tools for decarbonisation schemes, including this one also in Oxford, where you can use the PHPP, you can benchmark it against measured heating use as well, you can see here, and use that to help pick out what's the most significant energy using items to focus on. So I'll skip that. So I think our overall conclusion was we think it works. We've been fortunate enough to take a kind of a challenging site with a really good team, both on the design and construction side, deliver a low energy and high comfort building, which we think delivers really good architecture as well. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you so much for that, Gwilym. Our audience have been so far quiet on the Q&A box at the moment, so I encourage anybody to answer, to pop in some questions there. But I know, Barry, we were talking beforehand, and you possibly have a couple of questions to pop on here for Gwilym.
Yeah, of course, I'll always do. Gwilym, just in the energy balance where you had shown that, it was very interesting there. And as a seasoned sort of practitioner with Passive House, one of the things my eyes was drawn to there was the balance between the windows heat loss and the windows gained. And very often I like to see them in equilibrium. It looks like on this project they were very close as well. And I suppose the reason I asked the question or bring it up is if you have a distorted picture in that balance, it leads to probably what is the manifestation in overheating in the building. So maybe in light of the question, but also through the lens of this building, you might want to give the audience here, which is from Northern Ireland, looking at prospective passive house projects, about how passive house addresses overheating.
Yes, good point. Thank you. So yeah, like you say, that energy balance diagram is quite useful for letting people get a feel for, during the heating season, how much solar gain are you getting through the windows versus how much conduction loss are you getting. We've got I guess a mix on the scheme here really between the sloping roof lights, which are east facing, which pick up a reasonable amount of solar gain through them during the day, versus the ones that are on the that east elevation behind. Actually, if I share my screen again quickly. So these windows here, you're not getting a huge amount of solar gain through those actually back into inside the building, just from the dint of where they are, then the really deep reveal, and then going back. Yes, like you say, sorry. So for everybody else, the yellows are the heat loss through the windows in yellow here, and the solar heat gain through the windows over here. We've had a combination on this scheme then of doing the summer comfort testing within PHPP, and also doing some separate dynamic thermal modelling to look at what we expect the conditions to be on the different floors within the building, which I think is quite a useful thing to do for more complicated buildings. So it's nice to have, I think like you're saying, that combination of PHPP is good for flagging that up. It gives you quite a quick and easy to iterate on kind of qualitative risk indicator, because it's easy to change things like ventilation rates or how often the windows are open or things, and look at the impact of it. But it is a single box model overall, so it kind of averages everything across the whole building, and it's often useful to do some slightly more detailed modelling to look at one specific space or another.
Okay, I'll not hog the light, but I do have another question. It's probably one that maybe everybody thinks about, and it is, and again, we have to just caveat this by saying that's within the Oxford estate, and they're lovely, beautiful heritage buildings, so there can be increased cost implications with the nature of those types of buildings. But I'm not asking such a direct or blunt question about the capital cost, but it's more maybe about the prospective running cost that this building's going to have now, meeting the high standard that it has, versus probably the horrendous, running cost that the estate had to suffer year on year in the older building.
Yes, that's a good question. So, I don't have amazing figures for Corpus particularly, because the process for this one was effectively, we got invited during REBA stage 2 to do a kind of feasibility study to say, like, could you deliver this project as a passive house scheme? What would that involve? And so we worked through that. That went to the college and they said, yes, we want to crack on with it. Let's do that, please. We do have some from the retrofit scheme, the Utopia one that I flashed up very quickly, where that saw about a 85% drop in operational energy use between the pre and post retrofit scheme, and so that's off a couple of thousand square meters project. We think, touch wood, and who knows what's going to happen to fuel costs in the near future given everything that's happening, but that had seen a drop of about 150,000 a year in the fuel bills for that building. So yeah, there's some real money on the table for some of these schemes, particularly on the retrofit side of it.
That's incredible.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll maybe leave it at that, Caroline, rather than hugging the thing, but there is 2 questions there from Nathan and Gary, if you want to pick them up.
Okay. Why can I not see those questions? Are they in chat, maybe? Yes, they're in the question.
Yeah.
Yes. I was in the Q&A section. Okay, great. So Nathan has a question there. I'd like to know a little more about the approach. Well, first of all, he says, great presentation.
Thank you.
I'd like to know a little more about the approach to the existing fabric, the retained elevation you mentioned. What were the options?
Yeah, okay. So I think we did look at building up against the directly against the elevation, and decided to do the final approach, which is basically to do something completely separated off from it. So then we're kind of using the retained facade as a very historic rain screen in a way. So it's keeping the rainwater out, but it's not contributing to the thermal performance. It's not contributing to the air tightness or anything like that. And we've created a cavity between those two so that water that does kind of come into that point will drain down and back to outside rather than coming onto our build-up. I think there are a mix of reasons for that. One was it was historic fabric, we didn't really want to touch it, and also we didn't want to have the constraints of building up against solid masonry / stone in terms of moisture risk and the challenges that brings with kind of internal wall insulation. So yeah, we basically decoupled the two completely, and I think we did, like I said about the kind of community side of it, we did have a look and saw a few interesting Enefit projects. I think there's one that Mark Siddle had worked on, which had a similar approach of you almost doing kind of frame inside a box approach.
Good, thank you. Another one in here from Gary Kelly. So he said, hi, Gwilym. What decarbonization tool did you use in your HPP?
Sorry, what tool?
What decarbonization tool?
So within PHPP, we've on this one we just ran PHPP basically, and we've compared energy use intensities either against other projects or against the previous building schemes. We've done a few bits looking at whole life carbon, where we've tended to use one click for doing the LCA calc separately. We have played with pH ribbon a little bit for doing some of the embodied carbon calcs, but have ended up using one click for most schemes where we look at the embodied side of it. We have found the variance tools inside PHPP quite useful for if you want to look at, a retrofit approach and looking at stepwise impact of different decisions. So that's quite handy as well, but we don't have much beyond that. And there's a few little plugins that I think they're on the Passivhaus Trust website for doing kind of periodic heating and things like that. If you want to look at expected heating demands for a historic building with poor thermal performance where you wouldn't have been heating it 24/7 to start with as well. So they're useful as ways to kind of adjust the inputs for a PHPP to reflect a crappy fabric, basically.
Okay, thank you. Alice Davis has come in with a question. How many air tightness tests did you do? I recently attended a webinar where the team did a pre-window air tightness test, sealing openings temporarily with sheets or something. Another after the windows went in, and then a final one. Do you think these more tests are better? Okay,
yeah, good question. So we did quite a few, but that was partly, I think, because we had the archive as one airtight envelope and then the wider building as a separate airtight envelope. For the main building, we basically did 3. And so the first one was done as soon as we'd got the initial airtight envelope up. Because of the construction sequencing, the windows weren't too far out of step with the internal linings, etc. So we had a first test that's once you've got the smart ply, etc., up and the windows in place to be happy that the general fabric envelope is airtight enough. Then a second one when the kind of first fix MEP and penetrations was done, and then a final test for sort of formality for certification and to check that nothing's gone wrong. But at that point, you're really hoping you don't get any new information out of it at that stage. It should just be checking that nothing's trashed the good work that was done earlier. So I think 3 is a good approach. I think there's also some localized bits you can do of getting a leaf blower or something and putting it across windows as they go in, just to try and get a bit of qualitative feedback. So you're not trying to get a number off it, you're just trying to say, if I can put my hand the other side and feel air coming through, something's wrong. I don't need a number to say how wrong it is, it just needs to look at straight away. Great, thank you. So Anne-Marie unfortunately had to step off our call, but she has, as she said, she has a couple of conversation starters that you might comment on, Gwilym. She said there can be concern from engineers that hot water point of use heaters are very energy intensive and add to the electrical load of the building. If you could maybe share your thoughts on that, touching this via good design diversity calculations to demonstrate the loading is not significant. Yeah, okay. It's a good question, and also that definitely sounds like someone who's had a less enjoyable experience on a project as well. Yes. So yes, it's an easy one, I think, for somebody who's doing the electrical sizing calcs to get worried and say, oh, well, let's imagine that some sort of flash mob descends on the building and everybody's hosing the hot water taps all at the same time, and etc. etc. And then it's incredibly hard to get any of those apocalyptic scenarios to happen in practice. Yes, I think we've done some bits of work on that before, both looking at there's a British standard and an EN standard for doing diversity calcs for domestic hot water sizing. And then there's some research which I think Sibsi and some people have done looking at actual peak hot water draw-offs, which show that almost all of the pipe sizing procedures are really conservative. And so we've tried to use bits of that, and then also to have it in a slightly kind of layered discussion of saying, well, it's worth thinking through what the actual risks are. So a lot of the electrical protection is there to avoid cables overheating, but a cable doesn't overheat like that. It takes a while at it running slightly above its rated current as well. So you can have a kind of a triaged approach where you say, okay, what's the view on what we think the actual highest hot water demand is going to be, and then also how long is that going to last for? Because you're not, with the best will in the world, going to get people running the taps continuously for like 35 minutes to wash their hands in this building. It's going to be a pretty transient event. I mean, my very unscientific studies from gents toilets around the place is if you can get someone to actually wash their hands, you're doing pretty well. And the the residence time in a toilet is normally about 10 seconds before someone's moved away. So
Yes.
so there is, I
The
think
load
there
is low.
the load is very low. And I
Yes.
think the monitored data of projects is kind of supporting that as well.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Just another note from Anne-Marie there. She said there can be a lot of concern around cascade ventilation approach, around that cascade ventilation approach. She's just saying that she's happy to provide evidence of the exemplar indoor air quality that this can maintain to any interested parties on the call. Have you received any concern about the cascade ventilation approach, Gwilym, at all?
No, not that we've heard back. So yeah, and if Anne-Marie's
Yeah.
got some data to go with it, I think when we've had it monitored on projects as well, it seems like consistently to work pretty effectively. So it's good.
Yeah. And then Gary has come in with another question. And what are the main reasons for going for a ground source heat pump instead of an air source heat pump? What was it, just the additional cooling benefit?
So I think this project was probably atypical in that choice because of the the constraints in that there's no back of house to this building where you can tuck away an air source heat pump and have it invisible. You know, the roof is fairly exposed to all the views from over the top. The north elevation is onto some important public ground for the college. The east elevation is that retained facade, and you know, I'm not an architect, but I can appreciate that a nice air source heat pump in front of that historic wall wouldn't quite be in keeping. So yes. I think generally we've found that if you're looking at, say, a new build project and you can find a place to hide it, an air source unit will be more cost effective and give very similar levels of performance to ground source. But for a couple of projects, we've had this on one or two others where effectively you can't find a place to like discreetly and sensitively put the air source unit. A ground source one does make sense, and then you get that the cooling is a nice benefit to have, but there should be so little cooling in this building that you could do it actively without it needing to use very much energy at all.
Yes. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to, I don't know if you we're coming up to the end of our time now, and I have lots of burning questions, but because we're running out of time, I won't I'll have to save them. But I think in the words of Steve Bartlett, that famous podcaster, he always asks at the end, is there one thing today, Gwilym, that you didn't talk about that you would like to say?
Oh, good question. Yes, I think the key bit, I guess, would be if people are thinking about doing passive house on their schemes, you're much better off setting off in that direction and trying to test it early doors rather than saying, well, we're not quite sure because we think X, Y, or Z might be tricky, and then waiting until you've got like a really developed design and then trying to back end it in, because that'll be much more difficult, painful, and expensive. So if you think you might be interested, go for it from the start, and the worst case is you'll make your current design a bit more energy efficient, even if you don't go for full certification.
Fantastic. And well, just nipped in just in time there. Another one from Nathan. Following on from Barry's question, would you have any idea of uplifting costs for this project to achieve Passive House certification? A question we were regularly faced with against payback/value for money. And I'm not sure if you know Nathan, but he's with Queen's University, so the campus on this project would be well tied in with what he's trying to achieve there on that campus.
Yeah, so it's a good question. The very short answer is no for this project, because effectively at that early stage when we said we think we can deliver this as a passive house scheme and what's involved, we didn't kind of run the counterfactual from that point onwards. We have found on some other projects recently where it has been looked at in a bit more detail that we've got some multi-resi schemes where the difference between, say, Passive House Institute's low energy building standards and Passive House Classic, if you've done the design efficiently at the starting point, basically it's cost neutral, and to go to full Passive House Classic is proving to be about 1% or less difference. And on the retrofit ones, then that does get slightly more involved, and you have to do something that's more project specific, but you can take quite a big chunk off the heating energy demand and so on, and normally make some quite big savings that way around.
Yes, well, that question nicely rounds out in your final comments, as well as the importance of being in there early, because then you don't see you don't see those costs if you're trying to come in and almost retrofit the passive into the design process at a later time. And also when we're looking at rising energy costs, and as with the current crisis in the Middle East. And climate resilience, 1% is low in terms of the overall picture, isn't it? And what passive can achieve. Thank you, Gwilym. Thank you so much. I've learned stuff today. It's a beautiful building. It really is. And to see you bringing that archive building and the occupied space together in passive, and the challenges around that, and the complexity of the building and the space, it just says like there's really no reason why you can't achieve it. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. For everybody on the call, we have recorded the webinar, which we will be making available to anybody to listen to, or share to your colleagues afterwards. And with no further ado, on behalf of the Passive House Trust, the Passive House Association of Ireland, we thank you, and the Ministerial Advisory Group, we thank you very much for attending today. And again, kudos to Gwilym. Thank you.